The courtroom was cold, not just in temperature, but in feeling. Stiff wooden benches, scuffed floors, and the heavy scent of varnish mixed with tension in the air. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly, casting a pale glow over the room's muted tones. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were turning white. He was tall, well-built, with deep brown skin and short-cropped hair. His dark eyes, calm but guarded, scanned the room as if searching for something, anything that might make this moment feel less suffocating. He wore a simple navy blue suit, crisp and well-fitted. It was the kind of suit that spoke of quiet confidence. But today, confidence was the last thing Marcus felt. Across the room, the judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His eyes, pale blue and piercing, settled on Marcus with a look that was both clinical and dismissive. Judge Whitmore was a man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a sharp jawline. His robe sat heavy on his shoulders, as though the weight of justice itself was resting upon him. He was known for being tough, some would say ruthless. "Reynolds," the judge began, his voice low and deliberate. "I assume you understand the seriousness of the charges against you." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore's gaze lingered on Marcus for a moment too long. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips curled just enough to betray a quiet disdain. Marcus felt it immediately, that shift in the air. The unspoken judgment. The judge glanced down at Marcus's case file, flipping through the pages with an almost performative slowness. Then, with a faint scoff, he said, "Well, I see you've chosen to represent yourself." His eyes lifted toward Marcus again. "That's ambitious." A thin smirk tugged at the corner of Whitmore's mouth. "Tell me, Mr. Reynolds, do you have a legal background?" Marcus lifted his chin. "Yes, Your Honor." "And where exactly did you study law?" There was a pause. Marcus hesitated. Not because he was unsure of his answer, but because he recognized the trap being laid out before him. The subtle disbelief in the judge's tone, the unspoken implication behind the question. "I attended Harvard Law School, Your Honor," Marcus said quietly. Judge Whitmore's smirk widened into a thin smile. He leaned back slightly, his expression resting somewhere between amusement and condescension. "Harvard," Whitmore repeated, his voice coated in skepticism. "That's surprising." Marcus said nothing. He'd heard that tone before. The subtle incredulity, the quiet assumption that someone like him, a black man in a courtroom, couldn't possibly have come from the hallowed halls of Harvard. The tension in the room grew thick. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. A low murmur swept through the gallery. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "Well, Mr. Reynolds, I suppose we'll see just how well Harvard prepared you." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained still. He knew exactly what was happening. He could feel it, the weight of generations pressing down on him. The unspoken assumption that he wasn't enough, that he didn't belong. But Marcus had been here before, and he was ready. Marcus took a steady breath as the judge's words settled over the courtroom like a thin sheet of ice. He could feel the stares, some curious, others doubtful. A middle-aged man in the front row shook his head slightly, as if to say, "He's lying." A woman leaned toward her neighbor, whispering behind her hand. The bailiff stood by the door, his hand resting casually on his belt, his eyes fixed warily on Marcus. Marcus rose from his chair with a quiet composure that almost defied the tension in the room. He adjusted his tie and walked toward the podium with measured steps, the heels of his polished shoes clicking against the hard floor. He could feel Judge Whitmore's eyes following him, cold, analytical. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said, his tone sharp. "Before you begin, I'd like to clarify something." Marcus turned to face him. "Yes, Your Honor. Did you say Harvard?" Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Yes," the judge chuckled under his breath. "And I assume you expect us to take that at face value." Marcus's eyes darkened slightly. He'd been here before, not just in a courtroom, but in classrooms, boardrooms, social gatherings, places where his presence was a question mark, where his credentials were met with skepticism before they were even examined. He'd learned a long time ago that the world often demanded proof, not just of competence, but of existence. He set a folder down on the podium. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it, revealing a pristine diploma. The gold lettering shimmered beneath the courtroom lights. Class of 2012, Marcus said evenly. Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School. Graduated magna cum laude. Judge Whitmore's face barely shifted, but Marcus saw the tightening of his jaw, the smallest flicker of surprise behind those pale blue eyes. The gallery murmured again, a low ripple of disbelief. The judge's eyes narrowed. Well, impressive, he said, though his tone remained clipped. Shall we proceed? Marcus inclined his head. Yes, Your Honor. He turned toward the jury. 12 faces, a mix of ages and races. Some looked indifferent, others wary, a few curious. Marcus took another breath and began his defense. His voice was steady, controlled. As you've heard, the prosecution claims that I acted with intent to deceive, that I manipulated the terms of the contract for personal gain. Marcus paused, letting his words settle. But the facts tell a different story. His gaze swept across the room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I understand how this looks. A man like me, standing here, accused of fraud, defending myself. He leaned slightly toward the jury. But the truth doesn't live in appearances. It lives in the facts. The prosecutor stood, cutting across the room with a sharp voice. Objection. He's attempting to appeal to emotion. Judge Whitmore raised a hand. Sustained. Marcus's eyes flashed toward the prosecutor. A sharp-faced woman with dark hair tied back in a tight bun. She wore a gray suit that matched the cold edge of her tone. Marcus didn't flinch. I'm simply stating that perception isn't always reality. The judge's mouth tightened. Proceed carefully, Mr. Reynolds. Marcus nodded. He reached into his folder and pulled out a contract, holding it up for the jury to see. This is the contract in question. Section 4.2 clearly states that the agreement was contingent on the completion of the project within 6 months. That condition was met. Therefore, the claim of misrepresentation is baseless. The prosecutor shot to her feet. Mr. Reynolds conveniently omits that the completion date was changed by the client, Marcus interrupted, and I have the email chain to prove it. He walked toward the bench, extending a printed copy of the emails to the judge. Whitmore took it, skimming the contents with narrowed eyes. Marcus could feel the shift. The energy in the room was changing. Judge Whitmore's eyes flicked upward. This appears legitimate. It is. Marcus stepped back toward the podium. His gaze steadied. Your Honor, the facts are clear. The terms were followed. The accusations are unfounded. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair. His jaw was tight. His eyes lingered on Marcus for a long moment before he said, Very well, continue. Marcus stood straighter, his heartbeat steady. He could feel the shift now, not just in the courtroom but in himself. He'd spent years proving himself, answering questions no one else was expected to answer. But not today. Today the facts would speak for themselves. Marcus stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the smooth wood, his heart hammered beneath his chest, but outwardly, he was calm. The air in the courtroom was tense, like the sharp stillness before a storm. Judge Whitmore's gaze remained steady, measuring him. The prosecutor sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed. The jury watched Marcus with guarded expressions. Marcus cleared his throat. His voice was steady but edged with quiet strength. When I was 14 years old, a teacher told me I wasn't cut out for higher education. He glanced toward the judge. She said I should focus on something more realistic. A murmur stirred through the gallery. Marcus's eyes swept over the room, connecting with the quiet stares of the jury. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep me in school. I studied under the flickering light of a broken lamp because we couldn't afford to fix it. I walked past kids who laughed at me, teachers who ignored me, but I knew something they didn't. He paused, his eyes sharpened, that I belonged. Judge Whitmore's expression remained hard, but something in his gaze softened, just barely. Marcus took a breath. I worked my way into Harvard, not because someone gave me a handout, because I earned it, because I refused to let the expectations of others define me. He straightened, his gaze sharpened. So when I hear the suggestion that I couldn't possibly have a Harvard degree, that I must be lying, or that I'm not qualified to stand here, he let his words hang in the air. I know exactly where that idea comes from. The prosecutor shot to her feet. Objection. Overruled. Judge Whitmore's voice was low, but sharp. Marcus turned toward the judge, his eyes steady. "I don't expect respect because of a degree," Marcus said. "I expect it because I've earned it. Through my work, through my record, through the truth." He pulled out a final document from his folder and walked toward the bench. "This is the client's signature, acknowledging that the terms were honored, dated, signed, and verified." The judge took the document, scanning it with a furrowed brow. The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus turned toward the jury. "The facts are clear. The accusations are baseless. The question is not whether I followed the contract. The question is whether you believe that someone like me could have followed it." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Silence followed, a heavy, charged silence. Judge Whitmore set the document down. He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, then looked at Marcus. For a moment, the judge's expression softened, just slightly. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said quietly, "you've made your case." Marcus held his gaze. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge leaned forward. "I'll issue my ruling shortly." Marcus nodded and turned to walk back to his seat. His heart pounded, but his steps were steady. He passed the prosecutor's table without a glance. As he sat down, Marcus could feel the shift in the air. The skepticism had thinned. The weight of doubt had begun to lift. Across the courtroom, a young black man sat in the gallery, his eyes wide, his hands clasped together tightly in his lap. When Marcus's gaze met his, the young man gave a small nod. Marcus returned it with a quiet strength in his eyes. Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe. "Court is adjourned until 2 p.m. The gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack. Marcus stood. He collected his papers with slow, deliberate care. He didn't rush. He didn't flinch beneath the remaining glances. He had nothing to prove. Not anymore. As he walked toward the exit, the courtroom doors opened. Sunlight streamed through the gap, casting a golden light across the floor. Marcus stepped through it, his back straight. This time he didn't need to look back. Marcus stepped out into the courthouse hallway. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him with a low thud. The marble floors beneath his feet reflected the afternoon light, casting soft golden streaks across the polished surface. He loosened his tie and exhaled. His heart was still thudding in his chest, but the tension was slowly fading. "Mr. Reynolds." Marcus turned. The young black man from the gallery approached, clutching a notebook to his chest. He couldn't have been more than 20, his expression a mixture of awe and hesitation. "I just wanted to say, that was incredible." The young man's eyes widened. "I'm studying law at Howard. Seeing you up there," his voice faltered. "It means a lot." Marcus's expression softened. He extended his hand. "What's your name?" "David," the young man said, shaking his hand. "David Brown," Marcus smiled. "David, you're going to be a great lawyer. Just remember, credentials are important, but strength, integrity, those matter more." David nodded, his eyes shining with quiet determination. Marcus squeezed his shoulder. "Stay the course," Marcus said, "and don't let anyone tell you where you don't belong." David's smile widened. He stepped back as Marcus turned to leave. "But then, Mr. Reynolds." Marcus looked up to see Judge Whitmore approaching. The judge's robe was unfastened, his expression less severe than before. Marcus straightened slightly, instinctively bracing himself. Judge Whitmore stopped a few feet away. He studied Marcus with a measured gaze, hands clasped behind his back. "I misjudged you." Marcus's eyebrows lifted. The judge's gaze sharpened. "That was one of the most composed arguments I've seen in years." "Harvard taught you well." Marcus's eyes flickered. "Harvard prepared me. But life taught me more." Judge Whitmore's mouth twitched into the smallest hint of a smile. "I suppose it did." There was a quiet pause. Then the judge extended his hand. Marcus hesitated, then clasped it. The judge's grip was firm. A quiet understanding passed between them. "Good work today," the judge said quietly. "You've earned my respect." Marcus's eyes softened. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge released his hand and nodded toward the exit. "Good luck, Mr. Reynolds." As the judge walked away, Marcus stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the exchange settle. He could feel David's gaze on him from a few feet away. "Mr. Reynolds." Marcus turned back. David's expression was bright with hope. "Would you ever consider mentoring a student?" Marcus's mouth curved into a slow smile. I think that can be arranged. David's face lit up. Marcus nodded toward the door. Come on, let me introduce you to someone who can help get you started. David followed eagerly. As they stepped into the bright sunlight outside the courthouse, Marcus slipped his hands into his pockets and lifted his gaze to the open sky. He had walked into that courtroom carrying the weight of judgment. He was walking out with something different: respect, and the quiet certainty that he had just opened a door for someone else to walk through. Marcus walked down the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the concrete. David walked beside him, asking eager questions about law school and the finer points of courtroom strategy. Marcus answered patiently, his voice steady and calm. But beneath it all, he felt a quiet warmth rising in his chest. The weight of the judge's words lingered with him. You've earned my respect, not because of his degree, not because of his pedigree, but because he had stood his ground with dignity, strength, and integrity. Respect wasn't something Marcus had ever chased. He knew, as a black man, that people like Judge Whitmore had already made up their minds about him before he even opened his mouth. But today, he had rewritten the narrative, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever walked into a room and felt the invisible weight of prejudice pressing down on their shoulders. As they reached the bottom of the steps, David paused. Mr. Reynolds, Marcus turned. How did you stay so calm in there? Marcus smiled faintly. Because I've learned that anger gives them control. Composure? That's where real power lies. David nodded thoughtfully. I hope I can carry myself like that one day. You will, Marcus said with quiet certainty. You already know the truth. It's not about proving yourself to them. It's about knowing your own worth. David's eyes gleamed with newfound confidence. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Marcus's smile deepened. Just Marcus. David grinned. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Marcus checked his watch. Come on, let me buy you lunch, Marcus said. David laughed. I won't say no to that. They started down the street together, their shadows stretching side by side beneath the bright sky. Marcus knew that David's path wouldn't be easy. But if today had taught him anything, it was this: strength isn't measured by the degrees on your wall or the titles before your name. Strength comes from standing tall, even when they expect you to shrink. And respect, you don't demand it, you embody it.